Hello and good morning or good evening. This is Jeff Nasanov, host of the Space Madness podcast, episode 7. And as I always do, to find the goal here, space madness. I called it that because space exploration is maddening, and no one's disagreed with me yet. So we're going to continue with that theme. Today, I have an old friend from college, Loren Chang, Dr. Loren Chang, distinguished professor and department chair of space science and engineering from the National Central University of Taiwan. And we first met at UC Irvine 25 years ago or more, starting to sound like a little bit of time has passed. And at the time, we shared an interest in computer engineering and related subjects. Lost touch for a while, but have been talking again in the last year, among other things, about a shared interest in space weather, which is one of the areas that I consult on. And so I thought, given the space weather events in the last year, in fact, the other day we had auroras here in Atlanta almost, and the general other subjects of mutual and global interest regarding Taiwan, I thought he'd be a great guest, and very happy to welcome him here. So thanks for joining.
Hey, Naz, it's been a quick 25 years since the Loma days, right?
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, Loma, I was there about 10 years ago, or maybe it was 12 at this point. But now there's high-rise dorms there. They're like 5 stories tall. It's completely insane to think about
Still no
that
football
kind of
team.
change. True. Yeah. Yeah. So I was hoping we could start with, your journey to UC Irvine. We got a lot to cover, but I'd like to hear people's stories about how they entered the space field and, what motivated them. So I'd love to hear that story from you.
Sure. Like you said, it's a bit of a story. My family's from Taiwan originally. My dad went to grad school at Stanford University in educational psychology. And so we lived in the States. We lived in Palo Alto until I was 10 years old. Then my dad graduated, finished his postdoc, realized just how difficult it would be to survive in the Valley on a postdoc salary, and found a faculty position back in Taiwan again and moved the entire family back. So for me, that was a bit of a culture shock would probably be putting it mildly. Essentially for me, English has always been my first language, and I spoke a little bit of Mandarin at the time, but barely enough to maintain a reasonable conversation, and I barely learned a few Chinese characters. So going back into public school in Taiwan in the 5th grade was just a big shock, both in terms of culture, language, and also just the environment was quite different. That was 1992. Taiwan just came out of martial law in 1987. Taiwan was under martial law for over 40 years, probably the longest stint in the world.
Wow.
And at that time, there were still vestiges of that. Public school system was very heavily militarized, basically formation marching, morning reveille. And at the time, that was back when our government was still claiming to be the true government of free China. And so a lot of the things in the textbooks were completely unfamiliar to me. For example, I don't know, did you ever watch Where in the World's Carmen Sandiego growing up on PBS?
Yeah, and the computer games too.
And the computer game, yeah. So back then, I remember flipping open our middle school geography textbooks. And first of all, the map of China was the map of China circa 1947. Capital still in Nanjing. And national territory includes Mongolia. And I was like, no, wait, I know this isn't true.
Wow.
So the running
that
joke
was taught to you in 1992.
Yes. The running joke back then was because, so let's see, literature classes were mostly talking about how great China was. Our geography classes were on historical maps, not updated for the modern day. And history class was, at least the official version was, let's just say, not very firmly rooted in reality. So the running joke back then was, our literature is geography, geography is history, and history is mythology.
Wow, I have so many questions already. I mean, did having learned other things here in the U.S., did you feel compelled to say, hey, this is, how did you deal with that kind of?
Well, for me, it was. Yeah, for me it was, first of all, I guess I was still in sort of a state of psychological turmoil. First of all, just the change in environment. Also, the education system back then was very focused on rote memorization and standardized exams. Back then, you had to take a national exam to get into high school. And so all in all, I'd just say my overall mood and approach to life just suddenly went from pretty optimistic and doing pretty well academically to just sort of like dropping off a cliff. And so a couple of things happened. First of all, this was before the internet was popular. I sort of missed my life back in the States, so I was desperate for any material in English. At the time, we had one English language radio station in Taiwan, CRT.
Wow.
They were formerly Armed Forces Radio Taiwan back when there were still U.S. troops stationed in Taiwan until
Okay.
1979. But they were pretty good because you can ICRT back then was quite similar to the way NPR is now in the U.S. So I just turned on the radio, accidentally found them one day, and just because it was in
Mm.
English and I hadn't heard anyone speaking in English for so long, I just listened. And they have a pretty good newscast with international news. And so by the time I came back to the States in 1997, I think I had a better than average appreciation for what was going on in the world. I knew who Slobodan
Interesting.
Milosevic was. I knew that something was going on in Rwanda. And I landed
Uh,
back in high school in SoCal, and everyone's like, who is this weirdo?
so you came
Yeah.
back in what sounds like high school, ninth or 10th grade?
Yeah. So after basically falling into an academic abyss, I completely bombed my high school entrance exams. Worst
Okay.
subjects, math and science. And
Well, you
so
caught
I,
up
I
at
got back.
least.
Yeah. And so I got back. So I in high school I went to live with my uncle who is
Hmm.
in LA, and
Okay.
went back to normal public high schools in SoCal. And
Hmm.
two very interesting things happened. First of all, after being away from just teenage culture in the US for about 5 years, I didn't really fit in. I was always that awkward person who didn't really talk much or do much.
Well, I grew up here
But,
and I was the same, so it happens.
okay, fair enough. And the other thing that really interesting that happened was I remember taking my first exam in Algebra 2.
Mm.
And surprisingly, I got an A. That never happened before. So apparently, what the education system did in Taiwan was you get very good at the mechanical actions of solving equations and so forth, but you don't really know why you're doing it.
Interesting.
So I was quite
Yeah.
fortunate that I had a couple of pretty good teachers in Taiwan also, but also in SoCal, who just basically got me back into a state where I actually found learning interesting
Mm.
and found that I was actually not too bad at math and science at all.
So I really appreciate that story and all the details. One of the lessons from my career has been that you don't that there's lots of different jobs and roles that contribute to space exploration. My aspiration, I think, for 20 years has been very simple: is I want to make an impact on space exploration, and I found lots of different ways to do that, and very few of them involve doing advanced math myself. So I hope the listener takes that to heart because I know a lot of people would love to make an impact in space, but feel like they don't want to have the option because they never had the math background or related reasons like that. So what was your major at UCI? I can't remember.
Right. So, okay. How I ended up doing something space related to UCI is sort of interesting. So when I was a kid, I
Mm,
was very much into space. I think most kids are. Back then, my parents
mm,
had a tendency of buying secondhand books, buying secondhand
mm,
copies of National Geographic. I just went through all the space related stuff and went through,
mm,
followed books on the Apollo program. I remember reading
mm,
a children's picture book on the Voyager program. Thought it was just
mm,
amazing how you could build spacecraft to explore all these fantastic worlds so far away.
mm.
And of course, with my academic crash, that just seemed so far away for a while. But after going back to high school and climbing out of that hole, suddenly it didn't seem potentially that remote. So,
Okay.
so at the time, I'd say, a decent student in high school, probably maybe top 20%. So not quite the Ivy League crowd, but I'd say I had a solid foundation. So when it came time to apply to undergrad, let's see, I applied to a couple of schools, all public, because I figured my family couldn't afford the private university tuition.
Mm,
So I applied to a couple of UCs, UC Davis, UC San Diego, UC Riverside, and
mm,
UC Irvine, and also Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So for Cal Poly and Davis and San Diego, I applied to aerospace engineering because I thought, hey, that's the most direct thing to space I can think of. To Riverside, I applied to biomedical engineering because that was
mm.
the time when ER was still big on TV, and suddenly I thought, hey, biomedical sounds cool.
Sure.
And then I also applied to UC Irvine under computer science because I took a computer science class, AP computer science in high school, learned how to do basic C++ coding, found I
Mm.
wasn't too bad at it. And of course, those were the .com days, and everyone's like, yeah, this is where
Yes.
you go.
Yeah.
And
And that was
UCI is
the
pretty good.
probably that felt like yeah half the population of UCI was in the computer science program.
And the other half was in biology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So I got into all the universities except for UCSD. No hard feelings, UCSD. And in the end, between the Cal grants that I got and scholarships and also just the major, I ended up deciding to go to UC Irvine. because they offered a pretty good balance of, hey, what everyone says is an ultra competitive department, and Cal grants would be basically tuition free for the first 2 years.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I figured that'll be it, right? So I filled out the form, accepted the offer, and then something very interesting happened back in high school. So our physics teacher was pretty good, and besides having a really great sense of humor and a real flair for theatrical demos, he'd also keep us informed about events taking place in SoCal that might be relevant or of interest. And he
Mm.
mentioned, I believe this would be sometime in shortly after admissions were received, so I might get it, so probably sometime in March or April. He said, "Hey,
Mm.
there's Space Fest going on in Pasadena. If you go there and read a report on it,
Oh,
then you get
cool.
extra credit." Yeah, so I
Okay.
figured, why say no to extra credit? And besides, it had been a while since I had tried to engage more with space-related themes. So I went, and SoCal's a wonderful place if you're a space enthusiast because, let's see, you've got JPL, you've got the aerospace sector, the big three are all here, and then
Mm.
you've got Hollywood.
Yeah.
I remember going to a panel with the cast of Star Trek Voyager and DS9. That was
Oh,
fun.
nice.
Yeah.
My last guest was in Hollywood, a theatrical director, and had worked on some Star Wars and Star Trek stuff. So
And
okay, so you went to
so,
the Pasadena Space
yeah.
Fest. I might have been there
Mhm.
too, for all I know, at
Okay.
that time.
Quite possibly. So I went home and just started thinking about it. I was like, hey, space is not that far away.
Mm.
And, I went back to thinking about ICS and I was thinking, yeah, so what do I do? Write code for the rest of my life? And that seemed just a little less interesting. Of course, I know better now, but still at the time, I
Sure.
decided, I wonder if I can change my major to something a little closer to space.
Okay.
So I poked around. I heard from the grapevine that transfers into any engineering subject were almost impossible at the time.
I
And then,
remember that. Yeah. Yeah. People would start in computer science and then transfer later.
yes.
Okay.
And then I figured, hey, what's the other subject that would be space related? And suddenly physics came up.
Ah, okay.
Astrophysics, and
Yeah.
I figured, hey, that's also cool. So I wrote a letter to the admissions office, and I asked, hi, I was admitted to information and computer science, but I was wondering if I could change my major to physics out of personal interest, and they said yes. So
Well,
that was how
great.
I ended up in doing physics for 4 years. Found out I really liked it. I was pretty decent at it. Still not top one or two, but maybe top five in the department. And
Yeah.
so,
I continue to think that that is a great major for a large number of people because it is fundamentally the study of reality and quantitative and mathematical study of reality, which, at least for careers where reality matters and outcomes actually matter, that's a great preparation and demonstration of the ability to do so. I have a strong feeling my son will go into that, at least for an undergrad, in only
I really
five
like
years.
physics. I really like physics because it teaches you how to think systematically, approach problems
Mm-hmm.
systematically and logically, start with smaller building blocks, basic
Mm-hmm.
equations and concepts, and then combine those to be able to model or predict something even more complex. And for me, one reason why I always loved physics was just this idea that it was a systematic way of looking at and analyzing the world, and
Mm-hmm.
it would tell you things that in many cases could be completely counterintuitive, but you could back this up through logic,
Mm-hmm.
through basic principles, and then evaluate them experimentally to verify how well your model stacks up. So I'd say if you're interested in any field of science or engineering, physics is a really good introduction
Mm-hmm.
since it gives you a very good base to build on.
I agree completely, and likewise for finance. Apparently, it's a popular major for people going into finance.
Yeah, my
So
wife is in finance.
okay,
She
so
prefers to hire science and technical people.
there you go, there you go.
Yep.
Okay, so we're up to 2004. What was the journey back to Taiwan, or when was that? Particularly about your continuing observations about global issues and the bigger picture. That you already started in elementary school, listening to that radio station.
So let's see. 2004 was another uh, fork in the road for me. Not as drastic as flunking out of the high school entrance exams, but still fairly significant. Towards my senior year, I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do after finishing my undergraduate degree. I mean, we talked with alumni in the department who were in the aerospace sector, and I was thinking, well, a lot of them went straight to work for Boeing or Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin right out of undergrad. I wonder if that's still possible. But,
Hmm.
then at the time I realized I didn't really have any experience or background in things like CAD or more complex circuits. And so I guess the best thing to do at the time, I figured, would be to just keep coasting along on autopilot.
Hmm.
So I figured, okay, so if I don't know what to do, maybe I should apply to grad school in physics.
Hmm.
Yep. So, not really knowing what I was getting into, I figured I should go take the physics GREs
Hmm.
and completely bombed that.
Okay.
And that was back when the GRE subject tests were only offered once per year, I think. So I had to figure, okay, do I want to just spend another year preparing for the physics GREs again, or do I want something different? And at the same time, I started thinking, not having a very good idea of what a career physicist did besides
Hmm.
observing faculty in the department. I wasn't entirely sure that was something I wanted either.
Hmm.
So, I remember talking to my academic advisor at the time, and he was a plasma physicist. And
Hmm.
plasma physics, by the way, is also the only class I ever received a C plus in my undergrad
Okay.
years. And so he said, "Well," I said, "I'm having trouble figuring out what I want to do with my life." And he said, "Well, what subjects were you interested in when you were at UCI?" And I said, "Well, I found that I really liked astrophysics. Being able to use basic logic to derive things about massive things on huge time scales and spatial scales is really cool."
Hmm.
I'd previously done my senior thesis on adaptive optics, and
Okay.
then I also said that I also took some classes in aerospace on orbital mechanics. Found I was pretty good at that too,
Hmm.
and I kind of like applied physics also, basically using it to build something. And then he paused for a moment and then basically said, "Well, unless you happen to be God, there's no such thing as applied astrophysics." And so I figured, okay, what if I were to change my major to aerospace engineering in grad school? And he said, well, there are a couple of good aerospace schools that might fit your personal interests and talents.
Hmm.
And on the list were University of Colorado Boulder and University of Illinois
Okay.
Urbana-Champaign.
Uh-huh.
So I applied to both, got into CU Boulder, and thanks to me not noticing that if I wanted a TA ship, I'd have to fill out a separate form, I got my
Okay.
admission and also the bill for tuition for the first semester. Yeah. Yeah. So I figured maybe I should go and see if I can find a professor who would be willing to hire me as an RA, give me an RA
Hmm.
ship. So I wrote a letter to a couple of professors who worked on things that seemed interesting, structures,
Hmm.
GNSS, and astrodynamics. Managed to secure interviews with all three of them. But of course, one thing you often hear is we just don't have any funding at the moment, which can be true in more ways than one. But oftentimes, if you're a faculty member, you have to deliver on a grant.
Yeah.
Pretty high risk to take on someone who's only there for a master's and who you haven't
Hmm.
had any previous experience with before.
Yeah, I distinctly remember the experience at UC Irvine learning that the purpose of college, the reason for the existence of universities is not actually the instruction of young people. That was a shock to me, that the
Mhm.
instruction of young people was secondary to the research and the publishing.
Mhm. The To a certain extent, I think, at least the way I view it, is the educational part is part public service, but also part building your workforce.
Yeah, well,
So basically, if you need to deliver results, it's best to have
sure.
people you've trained.
Yeah.
And it's also useful if, actually, going back to the whole thing about not knowing why I was studying what I was studying when I was in
Hmm.
Taiwan, I think going back, it's also important for students to be able to first come in and then immediately have an idea of why they are learning all this stuff. What use does it
Yeah.
have? So, I think when we were in undergrad, one pattern that you often saw in class was basically, okay, we go through basically maybe like four-fifths of the class going into minutia, detail, derivations, proofs, and all that. And then maybe at the last 5 minutes, oh, and this can be used for this.
Yeah.
End of class.
Yeah.
It's more useful, I think. It's more effective, I think, in my experience, if you actually take that last application part and stick it straight in front.
I completely agree. And in fact, back then, I would often go look stuff up on early Wikipedia to try to figure out what the hell it was good for. And that really helped me understand concepts. And it kept it a lot more interesting. And I decided then that whatever teaching I ever did, I do exactly as you said, which is put the applications and exciting parts up front.
Actually, when I was in grad school, I edited Wikipedia.
Oh,
One of my
nice.
proudest accomplishments was actually taking maybe a 3 sentence article on the flying spaghetti monster and turning it into a full-on article with citations, which, as it turns out, was actually very good training for writing papers in SCI journals later on.
Interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
And your name is in the edit history for all of,
Yes.
for the next 1,000
Go to
years.
Flying
I love
Spaghetti
it.
Monster, look at the edit history way back in the early days, and you can see what the edits I made. Yep.
Nice, nice. So you did your master's at Boulder.
Yes. So eventually, one of the professors I talked to said, well, I don't have any funding for a research assistant right now, but one of my colleagues just came in and he does upper atmospheric radar and he might be interested in what you have to offer. So I went and spoke with him and, turns out he needed someone who understood physics because we had to do analysis of upper atmospheric physics and its effect on the waves and tides up at that altitude. And he also needed someone with some technical understanding since he did a lot of work in terms of radar design, but also radar data analysis. And I remember he asked me, so do you know what a Fourier transform is? And I said, oh, I just wrote an adaptive optics simulation. That's basically just Fraunhofer diffraction. And he said, okay, you're hired.
Awesome.
Yep. And so that was how I started. And then after spending 2 years finding my niche, realizing, attending workshops and conferences and realizing, hey, there are actually a lot of people from a lot of really cool sounding organizations like NASA, NOAA, AFRL, NRL who are interested in what I'm doing. Hey, maybe I should keep pushing this. And so I decided to stick around for a PhD afterwards. And one thing I really liked about aerospace engineering at CU Boulder is you actually have a very good combination of both science and engineering.
Okay.
So almost all the scientists know some engineering to execute some of the projects or missions that they are working on. And nearly all the engineers have some exposure to science because a lot of what they're designing or analyzing has applications to science missions. So besides getting involved in aeronomy, upper atmospheric physics, and later on ionospheric physics, I also had the opportunity to take more engineering-oriented classes. And one class that I really liked was Special Topics Space Hardware Design class, where we actually, that was a 2-semester-long class, where actually we had a team of students who worked on taking a laboratory prototype of a scientific instrument, basically a time-of-flight mass spectrometer, that was intended to measure the chemical composition of cosmic dust, and basically push that up the TRL scale to an engineering model that could undergo qualification testing.
Okay.
And so that was my first introduction to systems engineering methods.
So sorry, this was still at CU Boulder, the PhD.
Still at Boulder.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So
What
over the
year was
course,
that?
that would have been 2007,
7.
I
Okay.
think.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
So that
right
was a really
after
good introduction to me
college.
for participating in a systems engineering project, working together with teammates, understanding the importance of documentation, requirements-driven design, verification. And by the end of the year, remember we spent the first semester, the spring semester, basically working on defining the requirements, performing the analysis, coming up with the design. I remember handling the power supply design. That's my first exposure to Altium and actually
Yes.
drawing out circuit schematics, and laying out PCB traces, and then ordering components off DigiKey. And then I spent the summer doing a lot of soldering and testing.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And then we integrated the instruments in the following fall semester and actually subjected that to both functional testing and environmental testing. And I thought this is terrific. We started from basically a lab prototype that looked like nothing that you would want to send to space. And now we have a fully qualified engineering model. I learned how to design circuits and how to take something from a basic circuit diagram to full-on PCB design, order components, assemble and integrate everything myself, test it. And suddenly it's just a realization, hey, this is wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I love that. I had a similar experience at a later point in my career where I discovered my talent in proposal writing and management and more specifically helping the diverse community of people involved in a space mission actually say the same thing and tell the story of what they want to do. And I found that I was very good at actually coordinating a single coherent story. And because the subject is so interesting and exciting to me, the storytelling part really, that was my equivalent. So I can relate. So what was the next for you after the...
Well, going back to Wikipedia, I found I was fairly decent at writing up everything I'd done.
Mm.
So by the time I graduated, I had 4 first author publications, which is pretty good for a grad student.
Mm.
So I was already getting a couple of postdoc offers. Actually, what I did was I figured I'd do an unconventional gap year. So in Taiwan, we have
Mm.
mandatory military service. And
Okay.
so I decided to go back to Taiwan and finish my 1 year service just so I can get that out of the way as opposed to staying out of the country for until I was turned 36 and was off the draft rolls.
So why did that obligation apply to you if you were born here? Is there a dual citizenship situation?
Yeah, yeah, it's a dual
Okay.
citizenship situation. So when we moved back to Taiwan, my parents had me naturalized. Yeah.
I see.
So
Okay.
something interesting happened in those years since I left Taiwan. I'd still go back during either summer or winter break.
Uh,
And one feeling for me was Taiwan was growing with me. When I got
oh,
back, it was like, oh my God, it's so hot, it's so humid, it's so backwards, it's so chaotic. But things changed. The metro came through, and I was surprised when I ran into contactless fare cards. That was new
uh,
to me. And then in the late 90s, since waste reduction was a big issue, especially if you live
mm,
on an island, so we instituted one of the world's basically a waste disposal and management system, which has one of the world's highest rates of recycling.
mm,
And it was through some interesting policies. So typically in Taiwan, if your apartment complex or community doesn't have its own internal waste management, the way it goes is you use the municipal garbage trucks. And
mm.
so in the late 90s, to encourage people to throw out less, they started charging an additional fee per bag on the garbage
Okay.
that you throw
Okay.
away. But pre-sorted recycling and compost, food waste, was free. So there was a real
Okay.
incentive to encourage people to do waste separation and reduce waste. And so that really changed a lot. And also back when I was in SoCal in high school, I remember being a geek. I usually spent my time after school in the local public library doing homework, but also just reading random books.
Mm.
That's where I started running into books that were banned during martial law. And I sort of
Interesting.
got a little more background understanding of what they didn't teach us in school at the time.
Mm. This is in Southern California libraries. See, you
Yep.
have this really fascinating story, and I have so many questions for later about the difference in the university systems and so on.
Mhm.
But as you said, you grew up physically during the time, if this isn't an oversimplification, when Taiwan modernized. Is that
Yes. When
modernized
Taiwan
and
democratized and modernized.
okay,
So by the time I was getting my PhD and graduating, Taiwan had transformed a lot. You know, no longer
mm,
backwards, no longer Banana Republic like.
hmm,
I just figured, hey, Taiwan's really growing on me, and I figured, you know what, I'll just go back do my 1 year military service,
ah,
and once I get that out of the way, then I'll figure out what to do
I
next.
see.
I think
What?
also,
Let me guess that that 1 year has now extended to 2025, or is that a
yeah, sort of.
okay?
So I figured, it's just I just, I mean, I knew people who had various ways of dodging the draft and all that, but I figured,
Mm,
okay, yeah, there's a lot of improvements that could be made, but at the very least, it is a necessary job. And compared to, going to Afghanistan or Iraq, probably considerably safer.
fair.
And so I figured, I
Oh,
guess maybe it's
that was '08, right? So that was '07 or
2010.
'08,
Yep,
10. Okay,
around that
so
time. Yeah.
the global war on terror was still in full swing, and I can see how
Yep.
that comparison would have gone
Yeah, and I
that way.
figured if I'm going there doing something that is necessary, but not quite on the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan, then I guess partially pride, partially principle. I just figured I didn't want to look back in life and see myself as a draft dodger. So
Fair.
I went and did it. Yeah, and it turns out actually it wasn't as bad as one might expect. Of course, there are always a lot of issues about bureaucracy or inertia or
Hmm.
maybe lack of efficiency in some places. But in the end, from my perspective, was basically I realized there was a lot going on in the background to maintain sort of a stable situation that I previously hadn't thought about. So when I was doing my service, I was in air defense artillery. I was with the Hawk missile
Hmm.
battery, surface air missiles in eastern Taiwan. And I remember during specialty training, first of all, understanding the overall system. And for background knowledge, okay, so just the realization that around every major city in Taiwan, you have at least 3 or 4 anti-aircraft missile batteries on either 1 minute alert, 5 minute alert, 60-minute alert, or undergoing routine maintenance of various ranges. We have one of the densest air defense systems in the world.
Hmm.
And then you have fighter interceptors on 60-second alert at nearly all of our air bases. And so just the realization of all the work that had to go into sort of maintaining a stable situation.
Sure. The
And so looking
yeah,
back, I'm actually glad that I went and did that, not just learning about the situation, but also realizing how much work it took and logistics it takes to keep something like that running. And also at the same time, because of the draft, you had people in your same unit from all different walks of life and backgrounds, learning how to get along.
sure. Well, I can imagine your system engineering thinking was on overdrive also, thinking about all of the different layers in that national defense configuration, whether it's people or digital or infrastructure, industry, and weaponry.
Trying to identify problems and solving them in a systematic manner definitely is something that you get to do a lot of.
Yeah.
So in a Hawk
So
missile battery, sorry?
when did you were saying that in a missile battery?
Yeah, just as an example of logistics and what you have to do. For a typical Hawk missile battery, you have six missile launchers and one command post, two types of search radars, two illumination radars that are used to basically paint the target you want the missile to fly to. And then because all that requires electrical power, you have the diesel generators. So when I was first assigned to that Hawk missile battery in a training school, I remember learning about the overall structure of the system. I was thinking, hey, I'm an aerospace engineer. I know radar. I know rocket science. This is cool. And then when I got assigned my specialty, it was diesel generators.
Well, now you
So
know
I spent
diesel
a lot.
generators.
I spent a lot of time rolling around 40-gallon drums of diesel fuel and making sure that everything was running and providing power when everything had to be powered up. So part of the generator it sounds like the least cool aspect of the entire unit, but actually it's one of the most fundamental because if you don't have power, then nothing works. So
Right.
anytime anyone needs to maintain something or repair something, or we were on high alert, basically I would be there keeping the generators running and carrying around jerry cans full of diesel fuel. Yeah, that was the first time I realized I was capable of growing pecs.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
imagine that was pretty strenuous. So,
Yeah.
when did you decide to make Taiwan your home again, or maybe not again, but
Okay.
when did that become permanent?
So, during my time at CU Boulder, actually, a faculty member from National Central University,
Okay.
he actually spent several grad students to NCAR, National Centers for Atmospheric Research,
Okay.
in Boulder for their PhD studies. And I happened to meet him when he was on sabbatical. And he asked me what I felt like doing after my PhD, and I said, well, I'm just going to go back, finish my military service, and then figure it out. And he said, well, between when you report back and when you're inducted, there's probably going to be at least 3 or 4 months. Why don't you come to my lab as a postdoc and you can do whatever research you want?
Cool.
So I did and churned out 2 papers before I went back to civilian life. And
Mm.
time faculty position opened up at NCU in space science, and I applied and got in. And that's sort of how the story of how that happened.
Okay, so you went from your military service to back to college. So you have spent a lot of time over the Pacific Ocean, haven't you?
Yeah, let me think. Total time in the States, probably around 23 years,
Yeah.
and then the rest in Taiwan. Yeah.
Okay. So when did you go to the position at National Central University, Taiwan?
That would have been 2012.
Okay. Okay. So that it sounds like that's when the focus on space weather and upper atmosphere stuff really started to dominate, right?
Yeah, that was sort of my foot in the door, actually. So we do a lot more than that now, but actually, space weather and upper atmospheric physics, space physics, is actually a pretty good entryway into the space domain in general. You learn
Hmm.
about the environment, you learn about systematic ways of approaching problems. If you can learn how to build instruments both on the ground and for use on orbit, and so it's a really good ticket in. In fact, that's very similar to how NCU basically got into, and Taiwan in general, got into the space sector in the first place.
Mhm.
Um, we know that Sputnik 1 and Explorer 1 were launched as part of the International Geophysical Year of 1957, 1958.
Mhm.
People talked about satellites before then, but my understanding was uh, none of the major powers wanted to launch them because for reconnaissance or communications purposes because there was still no clear consensus on what international law says if you fly, say, 500 kilometers over some other country's airspace.
Hmm.
IGY was very convenient in that It was for science, which is basically a general good, right?
Hmm.
So the U.S. and the Soviet Union started to develop satellites to study the near-Earth space environments. Sputnik 1 was ostensibly to study radio RF propagation in the ionosphere. And of
Hmm.
course, Explorer 1 carried a package from James Van Allen to study cosmic rays and found the Van Allen belts. Now, a lot of other countries also got into space physics research at that time, including Taiwan,
Hmm.
including at National Central University. And that was
Hmm.
sort of how we got our foot in the door. So at NCU, we started doing space physics, primarily teaching research, but also some ground instrumentation, ionosondes and radar.
Hmm.
And then in the 1980s, when satellite remote sensing was becoming more accessible, but also more important, then we started getting into geoinformatics as well. We have a Center for Space and Remote
Okay.
Sensing Research. And that was when we built our first satellite ground stations on the ground.
Well, one of the
And
interesting things
then in
that I
19,
find, sorry, I think we have about a half second of delay sometimes, but one of the things that I find interesting is that the many of the spacefaring nations basically entered as soon as the cost of entering reached something that they could manage. And that was often kind of constrained the areas they could contribute to or effectively build systems for. And it sounds like that's a similar situation with the Taiwan space weather scientific effort,
yes.
CubeSats. Well, certainly the listeners of this podcast will probably think semiconductors as soon as they think Taiwan, and I'm sure there's some interesting overlap there as as Taiwan developed its independent semiconductor capability.
Yeah. So our national space program started in 1991.
Hmm.
And so at that time, it was a major government initiative. And of course, at that time, we had absolutely no background in space systems engineering. So what happened was the government rounded up a bunch of scientists and engineers from Taiwan and sent them to the US, Johns Hopkins APL, and also to
Sorry,
France for
we cut out
training.
there. Did you say sent people to the U.S. at JPL?
APL, Johns Hopkins.
APL. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Applied Physics Lab,
Yeah.
and also France for training in
Huh.
space mission design and also in space systems engineering.
Okay.
That was how our national space program got started. Our first satellites were essentially primarily purchased from major international contractors, but it
Mm.
was a matter of basically slowly building up capacity to the point where we could design and integrate and test and operate spacecraft by ourselves. So that happened with large spacecraft starting from 1999 all the way through now. CubeSats didn't really start in Taiwan till I would say the mid 2000s, early 2010s, and overall, compared to other universities or countries, the pace was actually rather slow going.
Mhm.
So in 2015, we had the opportunity to start a small satellite program in my department. And the reason that happened was actually one of my buddies from CU Boulder, who ended up working at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, LASP, at CU
Mhm.
Boulder, one day just called me out of the blue and said, you know, we have this great idea about an international small satellite program where we all try and get funded by our respective funding agencies for small satellite missions, share experience,
Mhm.
have students do hands-on work, build capacity, and then jointly operate these small satellite missions. So this was called the INSPIRE program, International Satellite Project in Research
Uh,
and Education.
okay.
Yep.
I have heard
So
of that.
so at the time, we were still trying to gauge who would be interested. And
Mhm.
then I figured, okay, well, one thing I learned as a faculty member was I'm fairly decent at convening workshops. And as it turns out, there was a need for someone to convene a workshop for Inspire for the first year, just so we'd get things kickstarted, review
Mhm.
possible payloads and designs. So I said, yeah, I'll go ahead and convene that workshop here in Taiwan. So we did, and that was how the program kicked off. And the payload that was selected was actually developed by a colleague in my department, compact ionospheric probe, an in situ plasma sensor with light heritage. Yeah. And so that was how we got started in small satellite and CubeSat engineering.
Sure. So space weather in general is an interesting subject, probably lesser known outside of space circles, um, as basically understanding what's happening in regards to what the sun is constantly throwing at the Earth. And it's a global issue. There have been countless events in the last 50 years that have caused major issues or nearly caused major issues. And it's interesting to think of a place like Taiwan so entirely dependent on semiconductor manufacturing, particularly vulnerable to this kind of thing, as well as, involved in power struggles to this day. So I'm interested, I really have two more questions. I'm interested in how the kind of at the government level, we like to talk on this podcast about government involvement in science and policy making and priority setting. How does the Taiwanese government view this subject? I imagine in the U.S. it's a military and civilian subject. I imagine similarly there. Do you find that your sponsors are knowledgeable about this? Because here in the U.S., nobody wants to be responsible for space weather, but I imagine perhaps over there it's a little different.
There are quite a few stakeholders. I would say, starting from space weather,
Mm.
one of the earliest points for development in Taiwan back in the 60s, and one thing that we're still very strong in, is ionospheric physics. So ionospheric plasma can refract, diffract, and reflect RF signals used for satellite communications and navigation. And it's also important for over-the-horizons high-frequency communication on the ground. So HF communications is important for ships at sea and even for aircraft flying over more remote areas if you don't consider satellite communications. So there are users, both civil and military, who need a way of monitoring the state of the ionosphere and also being able to predict signal propagation, or whether or not we're going to see basically diffraction, basically scintillation of GNSS signals as they pass through ionospheric irregularities. That's a big motivation. Another thing was, in the early 2000s, Taiwan was one of the early adopters of GNSS radio occultation as a remote sensing method to measure the atmosphere and the ionosphere. The rationale there was basically, so Taiwan is in the tropics and subtropics. Precipitation forecasting and cyclone forecasting is for us. And one of the problems with weather forecast models is they tend to underestimate the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So sometimes they just they aren't able to predict where it's going to rain or even whether tropical cyclones are going to be generated. So one of the benefits of GNSS radio occultation is it essentially allows you to measure the water vapor content of the lower atmosphere, at pseudo-randomly scattered points all around the world. You're not constrained to weather stations where you can launch radio sondes. And so accurate precipitation forecasting was one very big driver why the government decided to invest in GNSS radio occultation.
Okay.
And so that turned into the Formosat 3 cosmic constellation. This is a joint project between our space agency and also NOAA, UCAR, University Corporations for Atmospheric Research, and the U.S. Air Force Research Lab, AFRL. And since this was the first wide-scale adaptation of GNSS RO, the results were actually amazingly good in terms of forecast accuracy. And so for us, besides being able to serve our own needs, it was also a very big sort of exercise in soft power for us. Suddenly, at atmospheric science conferences, if you came from Taiwan, everyone wanted to talk about GNSS RO.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah. So there really has been this long-term cooperation between the universities in both nations and the U.S. government. I'm curious about having this unique experience between U.S. and Taiwanese university systems. I'm curious what observations you have there. Of course, here in the U.S., the universities are in there's a lot of turmoil here now as genuine issues perhaps are being overblown for all kinds of political reasons. But just curious what comparisons did you draw? And, what stands out to you having been part of both systems? And we'll first welcome co-host Wednesday the Cat, who's a little late today, but always welcome on the podcast.
Well, it's still Wednesday over here.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say a few things. Culturally speaking, I've noticed that educational institutions here tend to be a little more paternalistic compared to, say, universities in North America or even Europe for that matter. I guess parents have a higher expectation of some level of control or information over their kids, or at the very least, you just don't want the liability of saying, picking up the phone someday and some parents saying, "Hey, you never told me my student was basically on academic probation."
So that's more so over there, you're saying, or here?
Yes. So, for example, at most U.S. universities, if you're over the age of 18, you are a legal adult.
Right.
And your academic information is your private information.
Oh, sure. Yes.
If someone, even if they're your parent, wants access to that information, you have to give them permission.
Right.
In Taiwan, a lot of parents can't accept that idea.
Got it. See, I had thought the helicopter parenting thing was more of an American thing, but I I can certainly imagine as a parent of a teenager now wanting to be able to make sure that things are going well. So it's really interesting to me that that's the first observation you share. I'm curious about things
That's
like
that's the
administration
first
and
one.
okay,
Administration. Okay.
yeah, administration and the extent academic independence.
Mhm.
These general themes. I'm curious what you think about that.
I would say at U.S. institutions, there is, on the admin side, especially for university presidents, one very important role is fundraising.
Mhm.
I would say much more to the extent that we do in Taiwan. Yes, there is still some fundraising from public and private sources, but in general, the overall proportion is not as high as in the States. And
Okay,
so,
and is that
for
because
example,
there's a more reliable funding source from government? I mean, where do you see that coming from? Or is it because it's just a much smaller place and there's a lot there's fewer
we have
channels?
wealthy people that we wish would donate more money, but
Fair
I
enough.
guess the overall
Okay.
expectation is not as high in the U.S. Also, another thing is public universities in Taiwan receive a significant portion of their funding from our Ministry of Education. So there's sort of a guaranteed baseline there.
Sure.
Of course, this is augmented by overhead off of research grants, both from government and from industry. And then, of
Okay.
course, there's private donations, but not quite to the extent of in the U.S., although we just still do get some.
Sure.
I would
Sure.
say the private universities here tend to have more of an emphasis on fundraising since they get
Interesting.
less of their budget from the government. Tuition here is a lot lower than the U.S.
Hmm.
So I think part of the benefit of having sort of a stable level of government funding is basically uh, being able to keep at least basic tuition low.
Sure.
Another difference is the amount of overhead that gets taken off research grants is lower than in the U.S.
Hmm.
So for here, a typical research grant from a government agency, university would usually take 15% overhead off. In all
That's pretty
fairness,
low. Yeah.
the size of the grants here tend to be smaller than in the States.
Sorry, what was that?
But in all fairness, the overall size of the average research grant here tends to be smaller than in the States.
Sure. Well,
So if you were
one
to take like 50% off, then yeah.
yeah, I remember at Caltech when I first encountered a 60% overhead rate. And of course, just saying the number is not really the full story because some facilities have no other source of of funding for their power bill, than that. So, but of course,
Yeah.
it's a shocking number to encounter, and that is one area where I would like to think things could be improved here. So it sounds like you see yourself over there for the long term. I mean, how is the academic mobility and all of that compared to here? Do you see yourself being able to grow, indefinitely?
I like to put myself in a place where I'm always doing something new or
Hmm.
transitioning to something I hadn't done previously before. So I managed to get tenure very, very quickly, actually, a lot faster than average. So here in Taiwan, if you're an assistant professor, you have 6 years to get tenure. Otherwise, you're out.
Hmm.
And so I managed to keep my publication rate pretty high, and I actually got tenure after 3 years,
Oh wow,
which
that's
is
a
pretty
pretty big
fast.
difference.
Yes.
So you were a tenured associate professor. Does that even happen here to be tenured at the associate level, or maybe that's just not a meaningful comparison?
In Taiwan, yes. In the U.S., I'm not entirely sure how it is
Sure,
now.
sure.
I'd say one other difference is the pay differential. If you look at base
Mm,
pay, given cost of living, you'll live pretty comfortably. But if you look at equivalent dollar amounts, it doesn't look like that much. But
sure.
what most people don't notice is basically there's a lot you can, if you are very productive, you can easily double that amount through
Oh,
basically
interesting.
PI funds from your individual research grants. There are also university prizes for outstanding research, outstanding teaching. So it can be a lot
Interesting.
higher than it looks on paper. Yeah.
It sounds like there's a pretty advanced incentive system to really bring out the best of people over there.
Well, it's an incentive system, and I'd like to think it works most of the time.
Fair enough.
There are always
So,
exceptions.
yeah. So we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I'm curious what unprompted what you would share about your program and the research you're doing. What do you want people to know around the world?
Well, I'd say the space sector in Taiwan has really taken off over the last decade. So early on in the national space program, there was some attempt to try and get some of our local industrial conglomerates to contribute things like space-grade components or even subsystems. And quite a few companies took up that challenge, but then they found that they only had one customer. the
Yeah.
government for that one mission. And so a lot of them
Sure.
quickly lost interest. What really
Interesting.
changed and really kickstarted our private space sector and even our academic space sector to a certain extent was two reasons. One would be national security, and the other one would be actually commercial interests. So on the national security side, Taiwan is reliant on, I think, 15 or 16 submarine fiber optic cables for all of our external
Mm.
internet connections. These can break naturally sometimes, but over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of what we characterize as gray zone warfare by basically Chinese ships basically repeatedly towing their anchors over submarine cables and severing them. This happened the first time significantly in the first major significant outage a couple of years ago with a submarine cable connecting us to one of our outlying islands. And basically, people realized that not only was their internet access gone, they couldn't do something as simple as swiping a credit card.
Mm.
So there was a lot more emphasis on communications resilience, basically putting in shorter distance microwave links to our outlying islands, but also trying to, first of all, secure access to satellite communications from established international providers, and also in the longer term, trying to build our own platform. So this is where a lot more government funding went into SATCOM, and there was a lot more efforts by our Ministry of Digital Affairs and our major telecom provider, Zhonghua Telecom, to secure agreements with existing international providers. So early on, I know that our government did approach SpaceX for access to Starlink, but
Mm.
ultimately that fell through for a couple of reasons. One of which was because, according to our telecoms law, any company providing telecom service in Taiwan has to do so via a local subsidiary with over 50% local ownership. And that was
Okay.
not an option for SpaceX. So ultimately, we did sign contracts with first of all, Eutelsat OneWeb.
Okay.
That has already been onshored starting last year and it's gradually growing. And then
Interesting.
also, we also signed a contract with, I think the name of the company is Astranis, I think, for their
Okay.
we currently have access to LEO and GEO via established international firms.
Hmm.
The second commercial reason why a lot more private companies in Taiwan are getting into SATCOM is a big part of Taiwan's industrial sector is based off of either component level manufacturing or
Mm.
OEM, original equipment manufacturers. Basically, someone gives them a design, they tweak it, mass produce it, and then sell a lot to make up for the low profit margins on each individual unit. So we have an established supply chain and companies that are good at mass production, even some moving more into ODM.
Mm.
And for them, the growth of LEO SATCOM has been a very big driver because suddenly you have mega constellations of satellites that all need
Mm.
electronics or antennas or RF equipment
Yeah.
and need to be replaced at a very high rate. And
Yes.
then that's not to mention all the ground equipment, the user terminals, the modems,
Mm.
the routers that you need on the ground. So that was really right up the alley of a lot of local companies that were already established in the electronics and RF fields. Even the semiconductor
Interesting.
companies, a lot of them do
Sure.
work on RFICs, many of which
Mm.
have found their way into the supply chain for major international providers.
Interesting.
And then also there's the growth of our domestic drone industry.
Mm.
With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, everyone saw the importance of drones. And so there was also an initiative by our government to fast track the development of our drone industry. So that also happened in parallel. And we have companies
Interesting.
now that are working on incorporating SATCOM into either drone systems or anti-drone systems.
Wow. I'm curious to see the commercial trends of that change over time, and it seems like Taiwan is well positioned at every level, from the semiconductors all the way up to the integrated satellite connected drone systems.
Yeah,
Very
if you're free
interesting.
this November, I think November 4th through 6th, the Asia
Mm.
Pacific Space Community Council, oriented mainly towards commercial space, but not
Mm.
exclusively, is actually being held in Taipei. So if you're
Interesting.
interested in meeting Taiwan's space sector and the space sector and the APAC region in general, it's a very good event to attend.
Well, we'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes for that. Well, I think we're going to call it there. Thank you for this really interesting conversation, and particularly your own personal story of growing up into the space field while Taiwan did the same. So, what an interesting parallel. That's it for episode 7 of the Space Madness podcast, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nas. Stay in touch.
Absolutely.